House of Wolf, Part 6. Amalie became aware of someone shaking her shoulder and calling her name softly. She didn't know when she had fallen asleep, despite the torturous acrobatics of her mind. Groggy, she opened one lid and stared at the hazy, vaguely familiar face. Recognition came first, followed by shock. "Dad?" she asked as she slowly sat up. She was still wearing the clothes she had had on yesterday. Her muscles ached where she had hit the ground in her life-saving dive. She was chilled as she suddenly remembered everything, including her improbable conclusion on Wolfgang. Her father, Eric, was looking at her and smiling, but there was something else behind his expression she couldn't read. "Your gran called me and told me what happened. I flew in this morning." He sat on the bed next to her. Amalie regarded him silently. He was an older, heavier version of Wolfgang, except his gray eyes were hooded and red. His cheeks had the large pores of a smoker, and he had a considerable paunch. Still handsome despite all this, and there was strength in his tall, broad frame. "I was 4 or 5 when I last saw you," Amalie said in a cold tone. He winced, but Amalie stared at him steadily. He was essentially a stranger. Yet, he had flown halfway across the world to see her. She realized that she had just assumed he had flown in from Germany. According to their last conversation 2 years prior, he was on the brink of setting up yet another business in Berlin. Perhaps it had failed, as all his other enterprises. "I'm so sorry, Amy. I thought if I wasn't in your life, you wouldn't be a part of this madness." He made a gesture encompassing the room. He looked at her, and she could see he was sincere. Or at least she thought so. "I didn't want you here. I wanted you to have a normal life, away from curses and the madness of Fuchs," he sighed. "When we divorced, I made your mother promise never to bring you here. But somehow, my mother got her hooks into you. Here you are, my beautiful baby girl." He stared at her and his eyes misted. "Why didn't you come to visit me? I grew up thinking you didn't care about me. Do you know what that does to a child?" Amalie's voice rose and shook. Her father, perhaps on impulse, leaned over and enveloped her in a bear hug. He smelled of cigarette smoke, sweat, and Drakkar Noir. She remembered these scents and her eyes teared up. "You will never understand how much it hurt not to be in your life. I had to do everything I could to protect you." He leaned back and looked down into her eyes. "You're not safe here, Amy. Someone chased you last night, and I don't know what I would have done if you'd been hurt." He enveloped her again. At last she raised her arms and hugged him back. Her heart hurt from his long years of absence, and she didn't know if she could forgive him. But at this moment, when she was convinced her life was threatened, his presence was comforting. "I came to get you out of here and take you home," he said. Amalie wiped her tears and drew back out of his embrace. "I don't think Gran will let me do that before I agree to take on Fuchs," she explained. He frowned. "She's named me her heir," Amalie said. Her father's face sagged, and she saw the expression behind his eyes more clearly. He was worried. "Fuchs is..." He seemed to struggle to find the words. "Our family," he began again. "We aren't like regular people," he finished. She stared at him. He stared back and then grabbed her hand. "Come with me," he ordered. Caught off guard, she complied as he led her out of the room, down the hallway and then up the stairs to the 2nd floor. Again, despite the sunny day, it was dark in the hallway. Eric led her all the way down to the end of the hall to the door where she had seen Wolfgang's father go in. Her father knocked lightly, and she heard the sound of a bolt being slid open. Her heartbeat sped up as the door slowly opened to reveal a tall, thin man wearing a long-sleeved plaid shirt and dark pants. Amalie blinked as he was backlit by the sun coming through the slats on the windows. Her nose wrinkled at the strong, musty smell of body odor coming from the room. She now recognized the man standing before them was Auntie Grace's son, the one she had met at the gazebo. She couldn't remember his name now, but he smiled gently at her from behind his thick beard. Amalie blinked, confused. He hadn't been the man she had seen go into this room. She was positive. Her father nodded, and the other man stepped back to let them in. The pungent odor grew even stronger, and Amalie tried not to gag. The air was humid, and the streaks of sunlight did little to penetrate its gloom. Someone had nailed boards across the windows haphazardly. Amalie's eyes wandered from the Victorian-era bureau with its gilt mirrors to the large armoire to the extravagant yellowed lace canopy of the bed. And then she saw who was lying in the bed. She gasped and gripped her father's hand. The man lying on top of the sheets was the one Gran had identified as Wolfgang's father. He was staring up at the ceiling and not at them. He appeared not to be aware of them. His mouth gaped. Her father drew her nearer. "You see, this is the Fuchs curse," he said, and tenderly patted the man on the bed on his shoulder. Amalie's mind tried to analyze what she was seeing. Klaus Fuchs did indeed look like the creature from Babette's diary description. His face was completely covered with long black hair. It sprouted from every area of visible skin so that even his nose was covered. His sunken eyes gleamed from within the profusion of hair. His arms and hands were also covered with hair, and she could see his nails were long and jagged. He was indeed more beast than man. "How is this possible?" she asked, her mind running through every werewolf legend and folktale she'd ever read. Her father sighed. "We don't know. Charlene said Babette cursed us, but all we know is that in almost every generation, a Fuchs man is born like this. Klaus has been locked in this room since he was a small child. Charlene only lets him out on full moon nights. She thinks it makes him happy," he said with bitterness. Amalie noted her father's use of his mother's first name, so there was still estrangement there. "But is he, dangerous?" She dropped her voice, but the man on the bed did not appear to be listening to them. "If you grew up with your own mother calling you an evil monster, wouldn't you lose your mind?" a voice asked behind them, making Amalie jump. She glanced quickly behind her to where Wolfgang stood, glowering at them. He looked surprised to see her father, but then his lips tightened. "Leave him in peace. He's dying," Wolfgang ordered. Auntie Grace's son made a sound of distress and quickly came up to the bed and took a hold of Klaus's hand. Amalie stared at them. Last night, she had convinced herself that Wolfgang had tried to kill her. Now, watching him trying to protect his father, it seemed ridiculous. Wait. An embarrassing but intriguing question occurred to her. How in the world had Klaus fathered Wolfgang? She glanced sharply at her cousin, but he was unmarked by the curse as far as she could see. Her curiosity burned, but she did her best not to blurt out her question. They stood silently, listening to the rasping breath of Klaus. "Shouldn't we call a doctor?" Amalie whispered to her father. He looked at her and his eyes were filled with tears. "No. No," Klaus hoarsely whispered. His voice made her shiver. She breathed out quickly and closed her eyes to steady herself. "Think, Amalie. Klaus was dying, too weak to speak, and certainly too weak to have chased her running full tilt just 2 nights before." Her glance fell on Auntie Grace's son. What was his name again? Ah yes, Terence. He was still spry, but he seemed a gentle soul. She gave a start as she realized that while his arms were covered in long sleeves, she could see his hands were quite hairy. His afro and thick beard suddenly had new meaning to her. The Fuchs curse touched all the relatives in some way, it seemed. Her eyes fell on her father and on Terence, who seemed to be holding vigil at the side of Klaus. There was a sorrowful sense of resignation in the trio. Even Wolfgang, standing nearby, was touched with it. They accept this. How could they bear it? She felt a growing sense of dread. The atmosphere here, not just in the room but over the whole estate, was one of being stuck in time. A time where one accepted one's fate and there was no escape. No escape for Babette, or Klaus, or her father. I have to get out of here, Amalie thought, suddenly breathless and lightheaded. She brushed past Wolfgang and left the room quickly. She jogged down the hallway, eager to get into the light and fresh air. But as she passed one of the bedrooms, she heard a loud cry, and then a thud, and pulled up short. Her heart still racing from her anxiety, she paused, wondering if she had imagined it. Then through the door on her right, she heard a weak voice call out in obvious pain. "Babette!" Amalie immediately seized the doorknob and turned it at the sound of her grandmother's cry. To her great relief, the door opened and she rushed in to find Charlene lying on the floor, her body contorted. Amalie leaned over her, frantic. "Gran, can you hear me? What's happened?" she asked, too panicked to think of calling for help in that instant. Charlene's face looked odd and her lips twisted as she wailed again. "Babette!"